good afternoon. It's Monday, the 2nd of October 2017. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
So we're going to begin by saying Happy International Day of Non-Violence. Patrick, this is International Day of Non-Violence. They have commissioned an artwork, the United Nations, for this. There you can see it on screen. It is a gun with a knot tied in the end of the barrel. This is the Day of Non-Violence, and of course it has been a Day of Non-Violence already.
Yeah, to kick off International Day of Non-Violence, there was a mass shooting today in Las Vegas at the Mandalay Bay Casino in Las Vegas. Multiple people down, many injured, and the entire city on lockdown, so it's off to a great start, Mike.
Yep. Okay, well, look, before we move on to Catalonia, I just wanted to highlight this. Ian Crane tweeted this out at about 5 o'clock this morning. Because this is International Day of Non-Violence, and I just thought I would highlight some non-violent protest. This is the lock-on, which is taking place at the moment. Two guys locked together in this big barrel. Of course, inside that is a maze of material that tries to prevent the police from cutting them out of that as quickly as possible. But these guys, people active on issues in a non-violent way, this has got to be promoted.
Yeah, no, this is great. Well, speaking of non-violence, it would be good if maybe also some of the police forces adopted some of these principles as well. We saw Ian Crane being manhandled by the North Yorkshire police only last week.
Yeah. Well, of course, the big news is the referendum in Catalonia and the debate on France 24 here saying, defying Madrid, Catalonia's independence referendum. Mainstream media in general going nuts over the heavy-handedness of the security forces in Spain. Shocking footage shows Spanish firefighters beaten by riot cops after they formed Human Shield to protect independence protesters. Now, I'm not going to defend the activities of the Spanish riot police in any way because they are heavy-handed. There's no Spanish police in general are. If anybody who's watching the Vuelta, the Spanish cycle race, some of the treatment of people watching that at the time by the Spanish police was pretty heavy, unjustifiably so. But nonetheless, the mainstream media right across the board going nuts over this, and in fact, even some people that you might think should know better, Patrick, going nuts over this as well. Rajoy's crackdown on the vote ends with 844 injured, 90% voting for independence. But the question is, Patrick, what is this? What is this independence issue with Catalonia? So first of all, let's just have a quick look at where it is. It's the red hatched area up in the top right-hand corner of Spain there, obviously Barcelona being the main city, and a number of other cities along the coast. It's been a bone of contention or an issue of contention for a long time. But the question is, Pat, who is driving this? And I think this is obviously a foreign language, a Spanish headline, but I think everybody can understand what it says. It's becoming more and more clear who is behind this, and it is George Soros.
Yeah, this is a tough issue for a lot of people, Mike, and a lot of people generally want to support this move for autonomy, this move for independence on a cultural argument, I guess. That they have a different culture than the rest of Spain, and that should be recognized by the world. But when you have luminaries like George Soros, who has financed color revolutions all over the world, and who've almost always been categorically in the interests of Wall Street, of U.S. corporations, of the sort of the globalist agenda, if you will, which is really antithetical. It's against the whole concept of the nation state. It is designed in many of these cases to break down existing nation states, making them weaker, and that just really opens the door for other larger entities to sort of fill that vacuum of power, like Brussels, for instance.
Yes. Well, let's just reinforce Soros's influence here. This article from 2014, Europe blasts Spain over torture record, and this was Soros, the Open Society Foundation, commenting on this. And this one, how Catalonia became Spain's laboratory for smarter drug policies, Patrick. And this is from the Open Society Foundation.
This is right off of the Open Society. So you can see this drugs legalization issue, again, something that a lot of people will support on more libertarian grounds, Mike. Very popular issue. And so, but it's being used as a kind of an entree by the likes of George Soros in order to gain a foothold in a number of countries like Uruguay, like Catalonia. In the case of Uruguay, I'm just going to add as a caveat that George Soros' interests in a company like Monsanto, who is wanting to patent cannabis, and they did their first trial where? In Uruguay, after George Soros had pumped millions of dollars into the legalization of drugs campaign in that country in South America. In comes Monsanto with the first pot GMO trial. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so.
Right, well, we're going to come on to more of this a little bit later, because of course the question is why would they be interested in Catalonia so much? But anyway, the other question in my mind was, is Catalonia actually looking for independence, or is it not pro-EU? Does it actually want to remain part of the European Union? So we get a clue here from Politico, whose headline is "Pro and Anti-Independence Catalans Call for EU Help." So both pro-independence and the anti-independence sides of the argument, both running to Brussels as soon as they get into trouble. And let's move on. This article from Telesur, Catalonia, independence from whom? What's this about?
This is an excellent article here. I mean, it's one of the best sort of all-around analysis I've managed to read on this topic. This was actually published a few years ago. And what it does is it really shows this article shows the clear link between those who are pushing the Catalonian independence movement for a while now, including members of the Green Party, who are also European members of Parliament, and how they are also pushing the federalization of Europe. In other words, the United States of Europe. And here is a quote from this article. The number one candidate from Junts, this is the coalition of parties there, Romiva, is also a member of the Green Party in Catalonia, is considered independent, but is also a member of the European Parliament between 2004 and 2014. During his years in European Parliament, he heavily promoted the idea not just of an independent Catalonia, but also a federalist European Union by signing the Spinelli Group Manifesto, and one of the first major federalist movements in Europe. So these are the movers and the shakers of the United States of Europe, are also the movers and shakers of the Catalonian independence movement. This is very interesting, Mike.
Okay, so let's look at something else. And that was the vote in 2005 on whether to adopt a constitution for the European Union. And if we look at the Spanish vote as a whole, you can see that very, very popular. The European Union constitution was extremely popular at that time, unlike in France and the Netherlands and in Ireland. But 80%, more than 80% in the majority of Spain voting for it. In Catalonia, the vote wasn't quite so high, in the 60 to 65% range on average. But the other thing that was interesting about this, Patrick, if we look at the turnout, in Catalonia, the turnout was pretty low.
It is one of the lowest in all of Spain, basically. So they didn't the Catalonians didn't care too much about independence from Europe. They voted, 60, 70%. Those who did turn out, very low, slightly lower turnout in the rest of the country, voted for a European charter. So handed their sovereignty away. And so this is a great graphic. But, at the end of the day, Mike, my final comments on this is, those who are talking about now fighting in the streets for an independent Catalonia. So we can see from what we've just shown you there from those results, where were they when their sovereignty was being handed over to Brussels, along with Spain's sovereignty? And so we're talking about allowing Brussels to write laws, adopting the single currency. Those weren't issues for these people, but all of a sudden this is. So our question is this a real bona fide, real organic movement, or is this being driven by money, by much more powerful interests, NGOs, and international governance organizations, let's say, and associations who have a vested interest in breaking up the nation state? Because at the end of the day, Mike, this is what it's about. It's about weakening the concept of the nation state. And who benefits from this? When you have a collection of weak, smaller states, certainly a super state has a lot more power, finance, and overall influence, is going to be able to lord over those many small states.
And of course, we should remind ourselves that this issue of breaking up nations into smaller regions, absolutely a European movement, but it's happening in the UK as well through our own government, which wants to break up the UK not only into smaller nations, Scotland being one of them, but into regions and into city regions. But let's just remember that, of course, when Scotland had its independence referendum a year or two ago, Nicola Sturgeon absolutely determined to stay within the European Union at that time. So, in fact, independence was not on the cards.
No, independence from the UK, but then not independent from Europe. So then this is the similar situation.
Same situation
we see in Catalonia. Why would a smaller state? Here's the question: why would a smaller state want to be smaller, maybe less, drop their affiliations of the past, create tension in the process, but then belong to a bigger club? What are the advantages to this? Is this a psychological component to this, or is this just the natural movement towards small states? This is the question.
I would say that it's the former. And one of the interesting things about Scotland, of course, is it's used as a pilot for many changes, political changes, for societal changes, for changes in education, and so on. Catalonia, it seems, is absolutely the same type of same type of area, because it's being used as a pilot for many things as well. So here we've got Smart Catalonia, Catalonia's Smart Region Strategy, and this is from the government of Catalonia, so this is the people that have held this referendum. And if we just look through it, this is the type of thing they're really wanting to promote: the Internet of Things, big data, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, cyber-physical systems, wearables, smart robots, drones, mobile, cloud, cybersecurity, 3D printing. Some of these things have merit, but put in a particular context, in a particular political context, particularly if you've got Soros-type influence in here, then perhaps this isn't such a positive thing. We just look at the next one here. This is Smart Catalonia, Fields of Action and Framework. So they're absolutely promoting Catalonia as the test bed for much of this stuff.
Yeah, this is the test bed. They boasted that Catalonia is the lab. It's the lab for the smart region. This is the prototype smart city. So in terms of the city-state agenda or the city and regional agenda, Catalonia would be a city hub for a major region in the new Europe, which would be no nation-state borders, but divided into regions, which you've talked about many times on this program, Mike.
And just to reinforce this, of course, who's driving it? Europe 2020. So this is the European Union, European Commission once again. So there's not really much more to be said on this.
No, this is in conjunction with Brussels, this program. So Catalonia is not just any burgeoning independent state. That they have plans for Catalonia in Brussels. And so is it being used as a wedge here? Is it being used as the tip of the spear of a new movement in a new reformed Europe, a new federalized Europe? Is that what we're seeing here, Mike?
I think it is. I think it is. And I think just as a final point, Patrick, it's this type of event can be quite difficult for people that are pro-nation state, that are anti-European Union, who would be the people that would campaign against Soros NGO influence in other countries. Mm-hmm. And yet in this case would see the Madrid government as being the big bad bogeyman and be supporting the independence movement. There's some people have got to ask some pretty harsh questions.
This is a really tough, this is a confusing issue for a lot of people, and there's a lot of external players and agendas that are sub-agendas that are not in public view, okay? But so you have what might look like hypocrisy or inconsistency in certain people's political evaluation of the situation. All independence movements are not equal. They all have their own merits. They all have their own vices, as we spoke about on the Sunday Wire with Adam Gary last night. Mm-hmm. So they all should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. You can't just be always for independence and always for keeping the state together and so forth. But you do have a situation where people who want multiculturalism, open borders in Europe for countries like Germany and Sweden, and so it's saying that people from different cultures can't need to live together in harmony and so forth. But when it comes to Spain, they're saying, no, break that one up. They can't live in harmony. There's a big difference between the Catalonians and the Spanish, which there's not really. It's not like a foreign enclave in Spain or anything like that, but that's the way it's being treated in the media. And so what is the agenda behind this? I think we've identified it today, Mike.
Yep. Okay, let's just end on this one, Patrick, because you wanted to draw some parallels with Cyprus.
Cyprus and Scotland, as you said, we're talking about smaller states. And one thing I learned here, I was in Cyprus for the banking collapse in the spring of 2013. And speaking to the people of Cyprus, I actually went on the street. We talked to a lot of, especially the people who've lived through the different iterations of Cyprus in recent years, from the partition with Turkish Cypriot in 1974 and the Civil War and so forth, the invasion, sorry, and so forth. And what they said was interesting. They had a perfect excuse to bolt from the European Union when basically that country was bankrupted by the ECB. And so Northern Europe, the rich North, bankrupting Cyprus, punishing it like it did to Greece. They had a perfect reason, Mike, to want to dump the EU. And guess what? Even the working class people in the street said, no, we want to stay. We've earned the right to be in the club into the EU. And so they saw it as a way to put them on par with bigger states like France, like Italy, like Germany, kind of a seat at the table, Mike, as it were.
It's quite a psychological operation that's being played on people.
It's a powerful thing. So, you know, this concept of belonging to Europe is a powerful idea, and it shouldn't be underestimated. And so I think this is also driving some of the thought in Scotland, for instance, and it will in Catalonia. This hasn't kicked in yet. You'll see the talking points coming now. So Spain, standoffish with Spain, go to Brussels for some love. This is where it's heading.
Yeah. Of course, this is all about how we're governed, and I just wanted to highlight this. Now, I've chosen the Evening Standard, but this, I think, originated with the Times. And the headline is "Queen Furious at Being Misled by Theresa May Over DUP Negotiations." Now, this is all about how this current government in the UK ended up being constituted. And if you remember, Theresa May did not win a majority, sufficient majority to form a government, so she had to try to negotiate with somebody else to get her majority. Now, the language in this article and in the original Times article is very interesting, because it says that Buckingham Palace was furious with Theresa May following the general election after she misled the Queen about negotiations with the Democratic Unionist Party. It says that senior officials in the palace were said to be dismayed when the Prime Minister said she had a deal with the DUP, only for it to take another 17 days before the deal was finalised. Officials were also annoyed when Mrs May further breached protocol by claiming she had formed a government, and not that the Queen had asked her to form a government. So it was the language that she used as well. They say that the palace was alarmed by her formulation of words. They say that Mrs May showed a lack of courtesy as delays to the Queen's speech disrupted plans for Royal Ascot. And if you remember at the time, we were making this point that the Queen was more interested in Royal Ascot rather than the governance of the country. And so I'm unsure about how much of this is the language that the palace is using here, being polite and trying not to make use language is particularly strong. But the fact of the matter is that no matter how you look at this, Theresa May has usurped her power. She did not follow the procedures. She was not in a position to form a government whenever she claimed she was in a position to form a government. And I'm sorry to say it, but Jeremy Corbyn should have been given the opportunity to form a government.
At that moment.
It took 17 days for her to get to be in a position to form a government.
And during that time, she was organising a payoff
of a couple of £1 billion to the DUP. Now, the issue here is that she lied to the Queen because she said that she was in a position to form a government when she was not. And the Queen would then have had to go to Jeremy Corbyn to see if he was in a position. Now, I'm saying that the language that the palace has used here is soft. I'm just going to remind everybody, of course, that on the day of the Queen's speech, after Theresa May had formed a government, the Queen arrived wearing what looked like a very EU-looking hat, with
EU hat, yeah.
blue hat with yellow stars
and we were the first. We were the first person to point that out, by the way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the other point was that because of Royal Ascot, because of the whole issue over Royal Ascot, she did not wear her robes and she did not wear the crown. And so the question I asked at the time was the crown in Parliament? We cannot have a properly constituted Parliament in this country because the Parliament is the Commons, the Lords, and the crown in Parliament. So is this a legitimate government, a legitimate Parliament that we're living through at the moment? Is their agenda a legitimate agenda? I say that it's not, that they haven't followed the procedures, they haven't followed the Constitution, they're not in a lawful position, and to use language like dismayed and a lack of courtesy, this doesn't put it in its correct context.
Yeah, so the breach of protocol, I think they'd be more annoyed at the ruling party using a $1 billion bribe to form a coalition. That would be a little more, quote, annoying.
Yes.
I think it should be looked at, I think.
Okay, let's move overseas again. And last Monday, Patrick, we were talking about the Kurdish referendum, another referendum on independence. Well, things have moved on a little bit. Iran apparently has ordered a fuel embargo.
Yeah.
What's behind this?
So this is from the Iranian government, actually. So this is official. So fuel embargo on Iraqi Kurdistan region, and the ditto same measures being implemented, I think, by Turkey. In fact, possibly a full trade embargo from Turkey. Also the closing of airspace from Turkey and also Iran, which was predicted as well last week on these programs, and Baghdad itself suspending flights to Erbil. So essentially cutting off. And who's that going to hurt, by the way? It's poor people in Kurdistan, which is most people in Kurdistan could never afford to fly on any plane. This is going to hurt the sort of the bourgeois class, the middle classes, and maybe the supporters of the Barzani government, or the tribal leader Barzani in his ruling faction there. So they're the ones who are going to get squeezed, and those are the people that want to get their kids out of the country to go to expensive universities in Paris and London and all around, in Berlin and so forth, and Holland. So they're the ones who are being squeezed. So if you really look at this Kurdish election issue, Mike, there's a lot more here than has been reported in the media. And it's not just a case of these people want their freedom, homeland, and so forth. The election itself is dicey. We still haven't gone through the international election monitoring reports on this, but there's problems with it.
Yes, here's this report from the Assyrian International News Agency, which says Iraqi Turkmen document details Kurdish election rigging in Iraq. And you managed to track down a piece of video which seems to indicate that that's exactly what was going on.
Well, what's allegedly happening here in this video is someone marking yes ballots feverishly. Now, we already also have seen reports, Mike, of a low voter turnout. So a high result in terms of a 90% yes on the referendum for independent Iraqi Kurdistan Republic or region, but potentially a low voter turnout. We have allegations here in this report of people under 18 voting, dead people voting, the usual sort of election fraud accusations, but there's a whole sort of litany of accusations there. And so I've heard from people that I've spoken to from the region as well that yes, there's not universal support for an independent Kurdish state, and a lot of this has been created in the international media. And so we see the same talking points: never again, stop the slaughter of our people, we need a homeland. This all sounds very familiar, Mike. Seems like I've heard it before. So,
yes. Okay, a couple of advertisements. Media on Trial, Froome Stop Wars event in the Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church on Thursday the 19th of October. You will be speaking at that. John Pilger headlining it, Peter Ford, Vanessa Beeley, Piers Robinson, Robert Stewart and Tim Hayward all speaking. That's on Thursday the 19th of October. Details of that are on Eventbrite. It's easy enough to find. Just look for Media on Trial and John Pilger. And the tickets, I believe, if you buy them ahead, are £9 and £10 on the door. And then, this coming Sunday, Patrick, AV 8.1, Alternative View 8.1. Do you know what you're speaking about yet?
Yes, we're speaking about artificial intelligence and the information world that we live in, and how this is going to be more and more controlled by people that we will never be able to see. In fact, maybe not by humans, but by AI algorithms controlling what information we're allowed to see, what we're allowed to read about, what we're allowed to search about. It's already happening now. I'll show some of the details of that on Sunday. So
that's in the Connaught Rooms in London. Sunday the 8th begins at 11 a.m. I'm sure the doors open a little bit before that. Okay, North Korea, World War III threat. This was the Sunday Express yesterday. World War III threat. Will North Korea launch missile today? South Korea on high alert. So this is more fake news rubbish from the Express.
I thought the end of the world was on September 23rd. Then it got revised. It got moved back to September, was it October 1st or October 2nd?
Well, apparently it was yesterday, but
it was yesterday.
It didn't happen once again, Patrick.
So that was the end on the 1st. Okay, so
but,
anyway.
What on the face of it looks like much more serious news is again more fake news, it seems, because this is the Washington Post here. A North Korean ship was seized off Egypt with a huge cache of weapons destined for a surprising buyer.
Not only was this in the Washington Post, Mike, this was promoted by the Washington Post as their alert, their lead news alert for the last 24 hours. So this is supposed to be a big breaking story. So it's making it seem like they're smuggling money, weapons to terrorists, Mike. So when you actually read the fine print of this, it's nothing of the sort. This is supposedly a North Korean shipment from a year and a half ago that the UN's already done a report on, and which is them selling. North Korea is selling rocket grenades to the Egyptian military. Okay, and so there's a little more to it here. If you look in the fine print, this is buried at the end of the article where the good stuff usually is. It says, in any case, the February UN report, so this is not new news, this is not breaking news, this is old news being repackaged as fake news by the fake news Bezos Bugle, the Washington Post. So the February UN report on the incident sidesteps the question of who was meant to receive the rockets, saying that only that the munitions were destroyed by Egypt under the UN supervision, and the destination and end user of the equipment was investigated by the Egyptian general prosecutor. So no mention of that. That's actually the important part of the whole story. And so there's a cover-up by the UN, according to their own words. And that should be the story, by the way. That should be the story by the Washington Post, not the fake North Korean small arms trade, which is this big scandal. Why is this story being flooded into the mainstream news wires now? I think it's been to cover up and bury another potentially bigger scandal, which we covered on this show at the beginning of July.
Yeah, 7th of July. If anybody wants to look for the UK column news of the 7th of July.
Which was the story which was broken by the Bulgarian independent journalist Diliana Gitiniera about the massive weapons trafficking operation being orchestrated through NATO states with U.S. contractors buying and flooding Syria and Iraq with illicit weapons from not just Eastern European vendors, but purchased through U.S.-approved DoD contractors on diplomatic flights, Mike. That's a scandal upon a scandal upon a scandal, and it got absolutely zero traction in the global mainstream media. And so that's what I think this Post story is. Fake news North Korea arms story is being used to bury the real story.
Well, just to remind everybody what Diliana said, here's a short excerpt from that 7th of July UK column news.
It's shocking how they call them moderate rebels. How can rebels be moderate when they are heavily armed, when they kill civilians? Because I saw myself, one of those Grad rockets fell next to us in western Aleppo and killed and beheaded a mother and her child in front of me. I saw them dying before my eyes by the very same rockets fired by the so-called moderate rebels in Aleppo. Those were not moderate rebels, those were Al-Qaeda affiliates. And I traced those rockets, and according to the documents which I obtained from the Azerbaijan's embassy to Bulgaria, those rockets were transported on diplomatic flights. And what is important to say, how the scheme works, the airplane lands and makes technical landing on intermediary locations. For example, let's say Turkey, in Adana, or in Julik military air base, which is located just 200 kilometers away from the border with Syria.
So Diliana, brave lady.
Yeah, and so she really outlined what's the real story there. Those are weapons going into the hands of terrorists. And I just might add on this North Korea-Egypt arms story, okay? Egypt is a major beneficiary of United States military aid, and it's supposed to buy all of its weapons really for the money they're getting from the U.S., from U.S. vendors. Basically, that's the deal. The only country that's not allowed to honor that deal, of course, is Israel. They take the money from the U.S. and buy from whoever they want. But Egypt is also a temporary member, Mike, of the UN Security Council. So if this story is true, and there's an arms embargo with North Korea, or some sanctions and so forth, Egypt should then be kicked out of the UN Security Council. It should be kicked off based on this violation. What this tells me, Mike, this is a setup. This is a fake, staged, contrived incident used to somehow create some public relations demonization cloud over North Korea. Brand North Korea as a global threat. This is kind of another thing that this achieves. And what is it? We're talking about $30 million for 30,000 rocket-propelled grenades. I mean, that might have been set for decommissioning anyway, maybe because they're so old. So it's like that's a drop in the bucket for the United States. And they couldn't buy a PR like this for $30 million. So this thing stinks to high heaven, I'm sorry to say.
Absolutely. Well, something else that stinks to high heaven is this article in Bloomberg Business Week from about Steve Bannon. Now, just give people a little bit of background about Steve Bannon.
Steve Bannon is famous for being the head of Breitbart News. Of course, before that, he worked for a number of interests, including Goldman Sachs, and he was also very active in Hollywood, I think, in the film financing end of the industry. But when billionaire Wall Street quant Robert Mercer pumped, I don't know, tens of millions of dollars into Breitbart News in order to make sure that people like Steve Bannon could take home an opening pay packet of $700,000 per year for running a website, okay? This is what Breitbart News is. It's been subsidized by a Wall Street billionaire who's got a specific political agenda, and Bannon is a political operative who is on his payroll, okay? So now Bannon has risen to fame, become one of Donald Trump's close advisors during the campaign, managed to come right into the White House, was even sitting on the National Security Council at one time, very influential now. He's a big name in politics now. So he's managed to sort of ride this Trump wave right into a very, very key position, I think, in terms of influence politically. Now, not just nationally, Mike, now internationally, according to this Bloomberg story.
Well, was Henry Kissinger on the National Security Council as well?
I'm not exactly sure about that.
Well, it's an interesting question. Maybe somebody might want to find out, but we will.
He was advising Trump, and maybe that was set up by Bannon, or I'm not sure.
Right. So anyway, the headline of this article is Bannon's back and targeting China. From Birmingham to Beijing, the former Trump strategist is leading a movement of his own, now warning of the forced technology transfer of American innovation to China. So this is all about stopping Trump from making any close ties to China, any possibility of Trump, the United States, getting involved in the Silk Road project, Belt and Road project. They quote Bannon. Bannon said, if we don't get our situation sorted with China, we'll be destroyed economically. The forced technology transfer of American innovation to China is the single biggest economic and business issue of our time. Now, I just want to highlight this. The forced who's forcing it? Nobody's forcing it. This is not a forced technology transfer of American innovation to China. This is the corporate America wanting to make their goods as cheaply as possible, are handing that technology over to China to manufacture as cheaply as they possibly can. It's not a forced transfer, so that's nonsense for a start. He says that China is the single biggest economic and business issue of our time. Until we sort that out, we will continue to appropriate our innovation to their own system and leave us as a colony, your Jamestown to their Great Britain, a tributary state, is what he said. He said to Business Week that he had made up his mind to quit the Trump administration after some meetings in September at Henry Kissinger's house. So he went to visit Kissinger at his country home in Connecticut.
And a deal was made.
And he said they understood that, he was talking about the creation of the Committee on the Present Danger during the Cold War. And he said that they understood that you couldn't do it from inside. You had to go outside and, like a fireball in the night, wake up the American people. So this is how do we describe this man? He's maybe not the poster boy for the alt-right, but he's certainly promoting the alt-right. And the question then, Patrick, is if this is the type of situation that he's involving himself in, this is the campaign that he's involving himself in, there's a possibility he's going to take a significant proportion of the alt-right with him. But in fact, he's playing with Henry Kissinger here?
Yeah, so he has basically done a deal. He met Kissinger. It's in his own words, Mike. I decided to leave the Trump administration after meeting with Henry Kissinger. So what was promised to Steve Bannon? What access was he given as a direct result of his decision to leave the Trump White House? I think we can see some of the answers to that now. But that forced technology transfer so this is Breitbart language, basically. So this is clickbaity. This is clickbait headlines baked into some sort of veneer of a policy directive. And so Steve Bannon, if you watched his interview with Charlie Rose, he was talking about North Korea. All roads go through Beijing, and the way he couched the language. You know, in terms of geopolitics, I don't know he hasn't been studying international relations for the last 30 years or 20 years. He's been running around making money, okay? So I think he's a charlatan politically, but he's also very smart. He's a quick study. He's a great communicator. He knows the media business. So he will be a quick study, and within 12 months, this guy will be pushing the globalist agenda. If he is in league with Henry Kissinger and being given access to all these global outlets, which is what we're seeing here in this Bloomberg report, Mike. So Bannon will take the herd with him and will take some of this alt-right movement and redirect it into possibly a globalist pathway. So is this what he is? Is this the sort of agent that he will be in the near future? That remains to be seen, but it certainly looks like that's where it's headed, Mike.
The chat box has come to the rescue. Kissinger was advisor to the National Security Council.
There it goes.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, look, we're going to end on this. If you remember last week, Michael Fallon was crowing about what a great job Britain had done in defeating ISIS. ISIS was absolutely defeated. If you remember, he said that, or the Foreign Office said that Daesh fighters are being pinned down by the Royal Air Force in their former stronghold of Raqqa as the UK marks 3 years of tackling the barbaric cult in Iraq and Syria. And Fallon said, you know, Britain has made a major contribution to the campaign that's crippled Daesh since 2014, forcing this miserable cult from the gates of Baghdad to the brink of defeat in Raqqa. And so, you know, they were claiming success, the British, brilliant. Well, the Russians, in their truly sardonic style, have put paid to that. And this is the Defense Ministry spokesman, Igor Konashenko. And he said, as we come closer to the rout of Islamic State by the Syrian army, supported by the Russian Air Force, we're suddenly discovering that all these years, somewhere behind our backs, it was Michael Fallon who did more than anyone to help defeat the terrorists. It is fantastic, Patrick.
You got to love these guys. I mean, what's not to like about the Russian sardonic sense of humor? It is kind of a joke that Michael Fallon would want to grandstand and claim that Britain played any significant role in the defeat of Daesh, as they like to say in Westminster. But it's the Islamic State. It's not, you know, Daesh means trampled underfoot, bug. But you know what's interesting in Syria, Mike? And look at one of Fallon's statements, Mike, was and training our allies, he said. Fighting Daesh and training our allies. When he says training our allies, Fallon's talking about the moderate rebels. But in Syria, they call everyone Daesh, al-Nusra Front, Ahrar al-Sham, all the moderate rebel groups, the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, that Britain's been helping to train and equip, and who knows what other logistical support. They call those Daesh in the Middle East. Just a little newsflash for people who don't know. So they're all Daesh to the people who are suffering from these terrorists who are being imported and funded and armed by NATO member states, by their Gulf allies. They're all Daesh, all those groups, to the Syrians, to real people in the Middle East who are suffering under those brutal terrorism, basically. So yeah, it's worth pointing out. Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you very much for joining us. If you like what we're doing, please consider supporting us. We can only do this with your help, so take out a subscription if you possibly can. And we'll be back at the same time tomorrow, 1 p.m. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you then. Bye-bye.